Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the City of Leeds, I would like to welcome you to Leeds Civic Hall. Looking around the room, it's great to see so many old friends. Somebody told me before I come out that I had an old classmate here and one of my old tutors. And of course it's John Douglas, who was at the Northern College when we were mature students, and David Browning, who we had in 1982 on our introduction. We had a 10-week core course, and I remember David's breathing exercise and confidence given that perhaps led John and me on to other things. I also remembered when I saw David that John and I believe, David, you might have gone. We went to a peace conference in Perugia in 1983, I think it was.
Le Monde Diplomatique, Afrique Asie, and contributed to many publications in the UK, France and US. Since leaving The Guardian, she's been a consultant to the UN on issues of the impact of war on women and worked at the London School of Economics as a research associate. She's co-author of Moazzam Beg's Guantanamo memoir, Enemy Combatant, a British Muslim's journey to Guantanamo and back, in 2006. And with Gillian Slovo compiled the play Guantanamo, a review of her play Guantanamo that was published in Meridians in 2006 included the statement, "It was to be a tiny snapshot of what the war on terror means, but in fact it has proved to be, for many people who saw it or read it in many countries, a vehicle for understanding the profound world power struggle in which we are all, like it or not, involved." Her previous books include Hidden Lives, Hidden Deaths, South Africa's Crippling of a Continent, and Death of Dignity, Angola's Civil War. Her most recent work, I think, The Meaning of Waiting, in which she describes the lives of the wives of political detainees using their own words set to music, has been a major success on the London stage. Writing about the play, she demonstrates her skill as a writer about people and describes how, close up, I saw a truly frightening level of isolation, fear and despair, but I also heard touching love stories, saw the happiness of children placed above everything else, and an extraordinary resilience drawn from faith. And she also displays the power and impact of her work, as she relates, 2 summers ago, after the first reading of my play about these women's lives, one of the actors sent me a text message. She said that whenever she saw a veiled woman on the bus, she thought of Sabah, the woman whose part she had read and whose life she now couldn't get out of her mind. So it's not perhaps surprising then to know that Victoria is on the board of the Institute of Race Relations, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Widows' Rights International and the Amiot Trust. So I'd like to introduce Victoria Brittain, who will talk about the title of her talk. Oh, before I do that, I'm terribly sorry. There was also a message of support from the Embassy in Sweden. Every year we do invite the Swedish Embassy to come along and participate. They have in the past, not always able to get here. But they have sent a letter of support, and they've said, from the Ambassador, I write to express my wholehearted support of the Olof Palme Memorial Peace Lecture organised by the Leeds City Council Peace Link Group and Leeds Metropolitan University. The Embassy highly appreciates this initiative and all the efforts made to organise this event. So, without further ado, Victoria, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Lord Mayor, Lady Mayoress. Thank you very much to the City Council and to Leeds Metropolitan University for inviting me. I'm very, very pleased to be here tonight. The Mayor read you the title of my talk, and I've changed it a little bit since I had originally agreed what I was going to do. Because I should have, of course, added on to the places where I'd worked in war situations. I think he ended with Sudan, but I've added Palestine and, of course, the war on terror. So otherwise, it's as it was. Before I start, I want to say something about Olof Palme. 24 years ago, when Olof Palme was assassinated, there was a message of condolence to his widow from Oliver Tambo, the president of the ANC. And this is what he wrote. "We had come to know him not only as a leader of the Swedish people and an international statesman, but also as one of us, a fellow combatant who has made an inestimable contribution to the struggle for the liberation of South Africa, from Vietnam to Nicaragua, from El Salvador to Palestine, from Sahara to South Africa. In loving memory of this giant of justice, who had become a citizen of the world, a brother and a comrade to all who are downtrodden." Now, for me, those respectful, warm words sum up the loss to the world then. But I think they're a very sober reminder to us today of a different time, a time when a European government minister, as Palme did in 1968, caused an outcry when he marched in a demonstration against the US war in Vietnam, and he walked beside the ambassador of embattled North Vietnam, the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Of course, he was supposed to be a non-person, a pariah. And from where we stand now, just imagine a prime minister who denounced US foreign policy as truthfully as Palme did in 1972. Then he compared the US bombing of Hanoi to Guernica and to Sharpeville. Olof Palme's assassination is presumed to have been the work of the apartheid regime which so feared him. It was one of the many thousands of secret targeted assassinations in those years which the apartheid regime carried out in Europe, as well as, of course, all over southern Africa, and by which they were attempting to hold back the tide of history. Today, targeted political assassinations are different. They're not done by one man in a raincoat shooting another man in the back as he made his way home from a cinema outing. But they're done openly, often causing hundreds of civilian casualties, by American unmanned drone aircraft over Pakistan and Afghanistan. And for decades, the Israeli Defense Forces have made such assassinations their trademark, on the sea most recently, but from the air frequently, and also in foreign capitals, from Paris to, very recently, Dubai. Now, no government or former government minister has joined us, as Palme would have done, in the many hundreds of demonstrations here in the UK that have protested against the wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Gaza, in the so-called war on terror of the last 8 years. So this is why meetings like this are so important, and I thank the organisers again for inviting me, because it gives us a chance to remind ourselves why fighting for peace and justice can never be left to other people. It is the personal responsibility of each of us. Before I start, I just want to remind you of some of the great lies and attempted manipulations of history, which of course you'll all know well, but they always bear rehearsing. For instance, the great war crime of the British and American bombing of Dresden in 1945, which killed 25,000 civilians. Or, in 1964, the fake Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was the excuse for the Americans escalating the Vietnam War. Or, the 1967 Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, in which 34 US sailors were killed and 174 injured, many seriously, and where the Pentagon initiated a massive cover-up for its ally. Or the Cold War's covert wars in Central America and Southern Africa in the 1970s and the 80s, where the CIA and its proxies destroyed countries, for instance Angola, in the attempt to hold back nationalism in general and majority rule in South Africa in particular. And as we're meeting here this particular week, I think we have to count Bloody Sunday as another of those attempted manipulations and lies, and it's only been overthrown now after 38 years. But I'm going to really start here now with some very recent history. All of us have fresh in our minds the Israeli killings of at least 9 Turkish and American peace activists in the middle of the night in international waters to prevent their boats breaking the siege of Gaza. You know, they were bringing wheelchairs, dentistry equipment, building materials, and many other necessities that Gazans have not had for more than 3 years under an extremely tight siege. Besides those who died, many others on the boats were severely beaten or suffered gunshot wounds. All of them were taken to Israeli jails and then deported. Now, the descriptive words for these events are words like murder, piracy, and kidnapping. Now, these words are not used enough in response to this widely criticized outrage. Of course, we've all heard the Israeli version of their security threats 1,000 times in the mass media. But thanks to YouTube, many of us have seen what actually happened that night. And we've heard from those who came under attack, and we know how carefully the boats were checked for arms. And above all, none of us will be able to forget the 5 bullets that were shot into the young Turkish-American man, Fulkan Dogan. He was shot in his face, in the back of his head, twice in his leg, and once in the back. Just hold that picture for now. I'll return to the question of what we actually know later on. But I want to move to some more recent history. A couple of months ago, you might have seen a video which emerged on the internet called Collateral Murder. It showed the deaths of 2 journalists in Baghdad in 2007. Their names were Namir Noor el-Din and Saeed Shamak, and they were among the 32 journalists killed that year in Iraq, and almost all of them were Iraqis. But these 2 were killed with 10 other people, and at a point when many others, including 2 children, were very seriously wounded. They were killed on the street by US forces in 2 Apache helicopters. The US military claimed that this attack on the streets of Baghdad, quote, occurred after security forces came under fire. And that was the story reported by almost all Western news organizations at the time, although there were witnesses, but they were Iraqis, of course, who stated that there'd been no such firing. The US military justification held until this video came out. And on this chilling video, you can hear the pilots clearly. They're laughing and joking about the people they have killed and wounded. Now, part of the reason for the shabbiness of this reporting came from this terrible new practice of embedding journalists with the army. Officially, of course, it's for their safety, but in truth, and obviously, it's an attempt to control what they see and what they will therefore write about. Now, for 3 years, the American authorities fought off attempts by Reuters to use the Freedom of Information Act to find out what really happened to their 2 employees in Baghdad that day. Of course, the US military had every interest in maintaining a cover-up, not least because the pilots in question had violated the 2007 Rules of Engagement for Iraq, which only permit the use of deadly force against individuals who, quote, pose a threat to coalition forces by committing a hostile act or demonstrating hostile intent. These 2 men, Namir, who's a photographer, and Saeed, his driver, they were carrying 2 things, a camera and a tripod. So, how did this story come out on this classified video shot from inside an Apache? It was released by WikiLeaks, which is a small, web-based investigative journalism organization, which since December 2006 has released hundreds of documents and video from whistleblowers in areas as varied as the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and corruption in the Kenyan government. Now, just last week, the leaker, a 22-year-old soldier called Bradley Manning, was discovered to have been arrested recently by the military police and to be in custody in Kuwait. He's not yet been charged. Curiously, he was outed by another hacker and a WikiLeaks informant, who, after an online chat with him, decided that Manning, who had boasted to him that he'd also given WikiLeaks 250,000 classified US diplomatic cables, he thought this might seriously threaten US security, so he turned him in. Now, earlier this year, the New York Times revealed that WikiLeaks had been targeted by the Pentagon for its cooperation with military whistleblowers. Well, of course it had been targeted. Nothing is more threatening to governments than journalists getting the ugly, unvarnished truth of what really happens and putting it out to the public. In fact, 2 years before, the US Army Counterintelligence Center put together a report outlining the tactics whereby they would suppress whistleblowers, and it actually cited WikiLeaks as an organization it intended to destroy. Meanwhile, the WikiLeaks founder, first of all, alleged that his organization was being intimidated by American intelligence agencies. Then, he himself, curiously, narrowly escaped death by armed thugs who raided the compound where he was staying in Nairobi. And just in the last couple of days, it's been announced that he is being sought by US officials. Now, WikiLeaks took its idea from one of my favorite heroes, the most famous of insider whistleblowers in the maddest war of our time, Vietnam. You remember Daniel Ellsberg, the Rand Corporation military analyst, who in 1971 photocopied 7,000 pages of secret documents, which became a book, The Pentagon Papers. He did that by smuggling out several dozen documents each night, spending the night photocopying them and taking them back the following day. Can you imagine the risk he was taking? Of course, this expose of the secret history of the Vietnam War debacle fired popular dissent, and it definitely helped in bringing down Nixon and ending the war. The White House battled hard to destroy Ellsberg and keep their secrets, then they threatened him with life in prison. It's taken 40 years for a film on Ellsberg, which is called The Most Dangerous Man in America, which was his Kissinger's description of his former employee. It was actually released earlier this year and nominated for an Oscar as a documentary. These things take a long time. But I must go back to Iraq. Of course, there are dozens and probably hundreds of other examples I could have taken of notorious lies and cover-ups, which finally got into the public domain, sometimes in a courtroom. For instance, the Blackwater killings of 17 civilians in a Baghdad square, also in 2007, or the appalling ongoing case in Britain of the killing of the hotel receptionist Baha Musa in Basra in 2003 by the British Army. Or thirdly, the horror that's brought Fallujah to be a byword for malformed babies in the aftermath of the weapons the Americans used in their attack on that city. But I'm going to take just one more individual case from these new US wars, from Afghanistan. And perhaps it illustrates more than any other the depths of manipulating war reporting the authorities go to. Maybe you remember Pat Tillman. He's a star American football player who walked away from a $3 million professional contract to sign up with the American Special Forces and go to Afghanistan to fight the Taliban. He was redeployed to a tour in Iraq and then sent back to Afghanistan, where he died. His death was reported with terrific fanfare as American hero falls to enemy fire. But then, 5 weeks later, the army had to admit that actually he was killed by a friendly fire. It's taken all these years until now for the medical evidence to come out that actually he was killed with 3 bullets to the forehead from close range, minutes after he had called on the radio for a ceasefire. The theory that Pat Tillman was murdered emerged when his colleagues in Iraq disclosed that this all-American celebrity role model was not exactly what he seemed. He had been deeply critical of the Iraq War. He believed that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and he was urging other soldiers to vote for John Kerry. Above all, he had had a meeting fixed for when he left the army with the towering intellectual example of truth-telling, Noam Chomsky. Tillman was certainly perceived as threatening a media disaster for the neocons. Now, all these sad stories of individual tragedies in war point to the ruthless power that's employed to control the narrative of what a war is about, why it's in the national interest, and how surely our side is winning. You probably know that the first war correspondent was William Russell of the Times. He went to the Crimea and he brought home to the British public the horror of what really happened there. And ever since, in every war, there's been versions of this same struggle between rival narratives. People in power can always find journalists who are lazy enough or stupid enough to tell the story from their point of view. And on the other hand, with this great tradition of dissenting whistleblowers from within the establishment, there are always people in alliance with other journalists who enjoy telling truth to power. I want to tell you a story of one of my very early formative experience as a very young journalist in Washington. And this is the reason why I felt I had to go to Vietnam from there. I met Ron Riddenhauer, the young military whistleblower who exposed the My Lai massacre, which you'll remember, 400 civilians, including children and babies and women, were shot in their hamlet, which was then burnt. Many of Riddenhauer's friends had participated personally in this killing, and they recounted the day to him. He felt such horror that he couldn't keep quiet. He would be joining the cover-up if he did. So he wrote a long letter about it, and he sent it to people in Congress. Silence. So then he took his letter to the New York Times and to the Washington Post. Silence. Initially, he only got a hearing from a young journalist called Seymour Hersh, who was on an obscure news service called Pacific News Services, and then from me, the utterly inexperienced fill-in correspondent for the New Statesman. Of course, I was completely out of my depth in the magnitude of what he revealed and in the powerful forces behind it being ignored. As you'll know, Seymour Hersh went on to become probably the best-known journalist scourge of the powerful in our time. So I want to move on to talk about some other recent history to illustrate this basic point about lies and cover-ups on a massive scale, and to reflect on what this has done and is doing to our society here. I want to talk about Guantanamo Bay and the systematic use of torture by US forces. You probably remember US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who once declared that all the individuals captured by the US military in Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11 and shipped off to Guantanamo Bay represented what he called the worst of the worst. During a radio interview, Rumsfeld said the detainees at Guantanamo, and this is how he described them, all of them were captured on the battlefield, all of them are terrorists, trainers, bomb makers, recruiters, financiers, Osama bin Laden's bodyguards, would-be suicide bombers, probably the 20th hijacker, the 9/11 hijacker. We're learning a great deal of information from them about how Al-Qaeda operates, and we're able to stop other terrorist attacks, he said. Now, here we had The Sun with a headline called The Tipton Taliban, talking about 3 young men from Tipton who ended up in Guantanamo. If the Sun headline was a particularly crude illustration of the credulous media coverage of all this, it was not in fact out of line with the general tone of the Western media post 9/11, which was quite uniformly sheep-like in accepting the narrative of Rumsfeld, Bush, Cheney, and Blair, which set out to use fear, and specifically fear of Muslims, for what they called a war on terror, in which new rules were set by them to reshape the world in a new imperialism. Since early 2004, I've been working on Guantanamo, writing books and plays, using material from lawyers and academics, family members, and in the most recent years, from the Guantanamo detainees themselves. I've previously been a war correspondent in all the places that the mayor read out, from Vietnam through lots of places in Africa, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and the West Bank. The most important thing I learnt in these, which were for me initially very unfamiliar places, stood me in very good stead when I began to work on the war on terror. Because what I learnt was how not to fall into the great trap of being manipulated, which was hearing about the big picture from official military briefings, from interviews with Western journalists, and from spending too much time with other Western journalists. Instead, I learnt to listen to refugees, to individual soldiers, to women, and to families. These are the unknown people whose lives are ripped to pieces by war, and from whom I painstakingly worked out my own view of the big picture. The so-called war on terror, of which the centerpiece is Guantanamo, is the defining war of our time, as Vietnam was 40 years ago. Rumsfeld set out, in the quote I read, what he wanted people to understand about Guantanamo and the exceptional circumstances which, to them, the Bush White House decided justified overriding the Geneva Conventions. Now, the Geneva Conventions are one of the pillars of our common civilization, laid after the horror of World War II. And under these same label of exceptional circumstances, the Americans normalized torture by US officials. For every 1,000 times Bush said, "We don't torture," we know it wasn't true. And in the years since all that happened, we have discovered how completely wrong those statements of Rumsfeld and Cheney were. These were not people devoted to killing millions of Americans. They were not the worst of a very bad lot. They were not dangerous. What happened was that torture in Guantanamo and in Bagram brought many men to blame others, or in fact to confess themselves to terrorist acts or plans which were completely outside their actual experience. What we know now is that the vast majority of those in Guantanamo had nothing to do with the Taliban or with Al-Qaeda. They were farmers, they were students, and they were aid workers. They were Muslims from many places in the Arab and the Western world, including, of course, Britain. There's one man I want to mention who's in Guantanamo today, whose story epitomizes all this and should concern us in Britain here today. I hope some of you know his name. It's Shaka Palme. His wife and 4 children are British, but they live in London, and he was a UK resident, originally from Saudi Arabia. Long ago, he was cleared by the Americans, and the previous UK government publicly said they had asked for his return. Nothing has happened, and as the years go by, it becomes more and more obvious that here is a brilliant, articulate, innocent man who is outrageously continuing to be held because of the truth he knows, the truth about what happened to men in US prisons in Afghanistan and in Guantanamo. This truth will be a danger to the powers that have held him so unjustly. He is, for instance, or should be, a key witness in cases such as those of Binyan Mohammed, torture cases by ex-detainees. And before I finish, I want to urge you all to write to William Hague on Shaka's behalf. Now, just about a month ago, a former Bush administration high official called Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkinson made the public charge in a court case, in an affidavit, that Rumsfeld and Cheney were lying, and that as early as the summer 2002, they knew that the vast majority of the men in Guantanamo were innocent. How long ago is that? 8 years. 8 years of torture and injustice have deeply marked these men, including, of course, the 700 plus who are still there. It's also scored a very dangerous fault line within our own society because of British complicity in this injustice against Muslims. Among young Muslims, the knowledge of this injustice will not go away, and the fear that's been stoked by the media and the authorities in the majority community is corroding our society. Now, over the past year, documents have been released that showed how, in 2002, several of the high-value detainees, as they're called, such as Abu Zubaydah, were tortured and forced to make statements that linked Iraq to al-Qaeda and 9/11, which the Bush administration cited as intelligence to support its invasion in March 2003. Of course, the confessions were false, and there are many examples of the US Justice Department having, in fact, to recant in some of their court cases. And in one of the sort of shaming moments, which for other people will appear in the list of the things I said earlier on, Secretary of State Colin Powell, for whom Wilkerson was Chief of Staff, made, you'll remember, a completely shaming experience before the UN in the run-up to the Iraq War. And he used this false testimony, prepared for him by Mr. Cheney, to link Iraq to weapons of mass destruction. Now, what was all this fear propaganda about? It was necessary to distract from the fact that a small group of veterans of the American and Saudi-financed crusade against the Soviets in Afghanistan had united to use terrorism to humble the US, to get its troops out of Saudi Arabia, and show the corrupt Middle Eastern rulers allied to the US that they could face popular uprising at home. This was what al-Qaeda was, an organization that had a core based in the great lawless mountains of Afghanistan, but whose plans were not known or coordinated with an inexperienced Taliban government. This government in Afghanistan was trying desperately to rebuild a country ravaged by years of war between the Soviet Union and these US proxies brought from across the Arab world, and from a murderous civil war which was fought after the Soviet withdrawal by Afghan factions which did not initially include the Taliban. And it was into that situation that many of these Arab volunteers and volunteers from countries like Britain went to try to rebuild this country and ended up for their pains in Guantanamo. The American bombing of Afghanistan after 9/11 was presented to Western public opinion as a just war on many fronts, including a wholly specious concern to liberate women from the burqa, in which Laura Bush suddenly demonstrated concern for Afghan women who had certainly never before been on her radar. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. In fact, after 9/11, the Taliban made several offers to the Americans to bring Osama bin Laden to trial in an international court with Islamic judges. But the US chose instead to bomb the country into even further destitution and to send to Guantanamo, beyond the reach of the law, anyone they believed associated with the Taliban. And the media meekly accepted this storyline, although it was not justified by much more complex and inconvenient facts. In this war on terror, whether it's in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in the prisons of Bagram and Guantanamo, or the many secret prisons the US used for years while denying it, the Western narrative has been dogged all along by alternative narratives, such as the WikiLeaks video I mentioned at the beginning, and a network of mostly web-based news services, including radio and TV, such as the excellent Democracy Now! In America, and Cage Prisoners in Britain. All of these web-based organizations give an alternative narrative, a narrative told by families, participants, and increasingly by exasperated American lawyers and academics. Similarly, in today's other great ongoing regional struggle, now more than half a century old, Israel is beginning to lose its total control of its own narrative of existential threat, as it calls itself the only democratic state in the Middle East under threat of extinction from its neighbors and from the Palestinians. The extremely irresponsible current right-wing government of Israel has become a bit desperate about the increasing exposure of some inconvenient truths. I just named five of them. Its 20-year-old nuclear armory, its continuing occupation and ongoing settlement building, which has definitively ended all prospect of the two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, its house demolitions and ethnic cleansing inside even Jerusalem, its 11,000 Palestinian prisoners, including young women and boys, and fifth, as I mentioned before, the illegal, inhuman siege of Gaza. As a result of this worry by the Israeli government, its embassies around the world have created entire programs of propaganda visits and explicit attempts to create and maintain a false image of a peaceful, scientifically and artistically progressive country under constant attack from Palestinians. Maybe the IDF attack on the Turkish-led flotilla and the murder of those 9 innocent men and the successful combating of the Israeli narrative, which I mentioned at the beginning, in large part thanks to this new technology. Maybe this will mark a watershed in popular perception of that 60-year struggle for justice. However, hearing Tony Blair's untruthful platitudes this week about hopeful steps to the two-state solution, or the Americans' meek acceptance of an Israeli internal inquiry validated by David Trimble, I'm not very hopeful. This is where we miss Olof Palme. This is the voice of a leader who would have told these truths. Of course, everything I've mentioned is just the tip of the iceberg of the attempted control of perceptions of what happened or is happening in these wars. And as I said at the beginning, the question of what we know is key to our own ability to act. Of course, it's encouraging that we do know these details and many others, despite the expensive propaganda efforts to tell a different tale. And we should all feel great credit and great thanks to every whistleblower and every new media initiative. But perhaps the question we have to ask ourselves in a meeting like this is why, when the truth is in fact often available, so relatively few people appear to know or to care about this kind of truth. Of course, this leads me far beyond my title. Don't worry, I'm not going there. And leads me beyond our time into structural questions, but I'm just going to mention about things like the control of media, the control of education, and about how our society has become so depoliticized, so conveniently for the great commercial interests that gain from war. It also leads me back again to Olof Palme and the courage of truth-telling and leadership. And in Britain today, I think we have to do everything we can to support the leadership that we have that tells truths. And I will just name the leaderships in the trade union movement, and among a few rare politicians like Caroline Lucas, who do speak the current truths that Olof Palme would have done. So I want to end by again thanking the organisers for the opportunity to reflect together on some of these great moral issues in the name of a brave man of huge integrity. I think each of us must believe that we too can make a small difference by studying harder, by communicating better, and using the new tools of technology to make it increasingly possible to counter the dominant narrative of the powerful on these great big issues of war and peace, which matter so much for us all, or we wouldn't be here tonight. And I want to ask you to take a first step, 2 of them actually. When you go home, check out on YouTube the great new version of the 1960s anthem of popular resistance, We Shall Overcome. It's sung by the great Roger Waters against a backdrop of Gaza, homeless children, and the war which towers over West Bank villages. It's utterly brilliant. And also, as I said before, please write to William Hague on Shaka Arma's behalf and for his sad family's sake. Before I left London, I called his wife and I told her, I'm going to a different city, and of course, I'd talk about Shaka. And she said, do you think anybody will listen? I said, yes, I know they will. Thank you very much. Sorry, I thought I'd finished.
Thank you very much, Victoria. fascinating, thought-provoking speech. I think we have some time, although I can't see what the time is. We do have...
It's 8:30.
Yeah, so we have some time for some questions and discussion. Hand up here. Yep.
So was it South Africa that assassinated him, or was it the Middle East? I've been told it was somebody from Iran that might have knocked him off.
Did you mean Olof Palme?
Olof Palme, yeah.
Oh, Olof Palme. Should I come here? The presumption is that it was done by the apartheid regime, although in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a lot of people hoped that there would be a clear confession, and there wasn't. But there were other similar murders, like, I don't know if you remember, Dulce September was killed in exactly the same sort of way in Paris, and there were various other attempts. So that is the assumption.
Hang on, there's a microphone. Could you use the microphone? Sorry.
You have experienced a lot of time in media that we all appear that there appears to be either apathy or deliberate avoidance of the truth. How can this be the case? Are we lazy, ignorant, combination of the two? Where do you get your source material? You said where you got your source material. Why are we such a minority? How can this be?
Anybody else like to answer that question? Well, as I said towards the end, I mean, there are many reasons, and there are big structural reasons about our society. And as I said, they're due partly to who controls the media, who controls the kind of commercialism that turns our young people a bit brain dead and keen on shopping and stuff like that all the time. These are very big questions, and it's way beyond my brief today, so please don't push me on that. But if anyone else has an answer, please give it.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and I think we're all inspired by what you have to say. And it does seem important to bring things into the light where they can be known about and put forward. I'm just very conscious that just a few miles up the road from here, there are a series of golf balls on the North York Moors called Menwood Hill, which is actually part of the world's biggest weapon system, run primarily by the Americans and quite unaccountable to, as far as I can see, anybody beyond themselves. And there is a need somehow to bring the light. From the successful campaigns you've been involved in, what else do you think we ought to be doing to try and actually get the world to care?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you think I've been involved in successful campaigns. My friend Jeremy Corbyn has a joke that whenever he's on a platform and it's just him and me, you're really in trouble. And I often feel a bit like that. I don't think I've been involved in any successful campaigns, actually. I mean, I've been campaigning on Guantanamo, and I've been campaigning on control orders and all this kind of thing, for nearly a decade. Nothing. But the great success for all of us who are in anti-apartheid is, it worked. And often people ask me about, the parallels between anti-apartheid and Palestine, and why isn't it going to be sort of quickly over? I say quickly over. It wasn't quickly over. It took decades to move anything on South Africa. And of course, afterwards, within 5 minutes, you couldn't find anybody who'd been in favour of apartheid. And we used to joke about the fact that when they when the new government held receptions at South Africa House, the people who then came inside, who'd been the ones demonstrating, were totally swamped by the numbers of people who had been ousting us as communists and troublemakers and one thing and another. But suddenly, they become very keen on South Africa. So South Africa is a great example we all hold on to, that things can change. But when you say, what more can we do? All we can do is work on the different small or big campaigns that we're all involved in, whether it's CND or whether it's something local. You just have to keep plodding on at it. There aren't any shortcuts, unfortunately. Sorry, long answer, rather depressing.
Always think positive.
Yeah, well, think about South Africa every time you want to think positive.
So, good evening. I would like to make a comment based on your comparison with Israel and South Africa. I think the plight of the Palestinians resembles more the case of the Native Americans rather than the Azanians in South Africa. This is because of the historical discrimination against indigenous people of colonial powers that have been based on cultural racism. In terms of how the Native Americans have led their case against the United States exercising the power of guardianship over them, is to reject this wardship principle. And it's very important because they really want to be treated as equal citizens and as sovereign rather than as the embodiments of the United States hegemony over their territories. It's become a very significant issue, and unfortunately in Western media the Native American cause is not represented because A, they want to hide the initial colonial process by which Britain controlled the North American continent that included a lot of atrocities against them. And secondly, because it's a very sensitive subject to the United States, where they have to accommodate the Native Americans in their own constitution. Therefore, it's a dual issue, which is firstly to understand the parallel between peoples, and it's not to generalize and to sum up with South Africa as the necessary comparison, but to see more the deeper into issues which may have a more historical link based on cultural racism, and that's parallel between the Indians of North America and the Palestinians. In fact, they're both coming closer together, and there's a platform now between them and the tribes such as the Sioux have been very sympathetic to the Palestinians in recent times. So I think there is a move towards that accommodation and cooperation that is actually very positive from those who would like to further the Palestinian cause. And secondly, to understand the very transitional attention span of the Western public, which tends to gloss over these main issues and go over to the next page and forget about what they've just read recently. And I don't know what is the reason for that, and I don't really want to speculate. I think it's really a case of understanding more deeply and more passionately and more reflectively about the historical injustices that are taking place.
Thank you very much for that very interesting, thought-provoking intervention. But you basically ended up by saying what I said. You know, we all have to study more. We all have to reflect more and not get depressed. Just keep going.
Gentleman in the middle here.
I just follow partly in connection with the first question about responsibility for the death of Palme. Another very important citizen of Sweden, Bernd Carlson, of course, who was on the Lockerbie flight. I was with him actually a short time before he boarded that plane. And in fact, I just mentioned that he had agreed
don't have any light to shed on it, and I think, again, it's a very important and interesting case, and it comes under our friend's heading of, you know, more study. Well, like many things around that plane crash and everything, it's a very dirty business, I'm sure. But I didn't have any more information. I'm sure I had less than you because you're a specialist in this particular.
I echo Martin's comments about fantastic exploration, and thank you for the words that you've given, which are really thought-provoking and stimulating. I suppose my question is what makes a whistleblower? I've several words and concepts just going around in my head in terms of there's conscience and there's questioning, but there's obedience and there's loyalty. And within the military, for example, the obedience is regarded as absolute and the questioning is something thou shalt not. So why some and not others? What makes a whistleblower?
Oh, that's a really hard question. Well, I think you've come up with some of the right answers. I mean, the obvious one is conscience. And I always remember there's a very nice book of interviews with Noam Chomsky. It's a very old book. And the person asked him, you know, what made you decide to go into kind of full-scale dissidence on the Vietnam War when, you know, you had a wife and children and a nice job at MIT, and suddenly you appeared to just step off that ladder. And Chomsky, in his very quiet way, said, well, I guess it was so that I could look myself in the face in the morning when I'm shaving. And I thought that was just a very nice, modest way of saying, like I tried to say, it's up to each of us. There are no guides on this.
I wonder if I can ask one question. You mentioned about the previous administration in the US, quite a lot, Bush and Cheney and so on. What's your feel for the new administration? Do you feel Obama is, well, he's obviously a different kind of person, but is he going to be able to make much of a change in his time as president? Well, I have to say that of all the political disappointments I've had in my life, and they've been many, the fact that having made his first public act as president to sign the order that Guantanamo Bay would be closed in a year, and the year passed, not only is it not closed down, but they have not been able to find any way of freeing those people, judging those people, taking them to a prison in America. Complete paralysis on this issue has been the order of the last 16, 18, whatever it is, months. And for me, that is kind of, I mean, there are many other things on which he's behaved appallingly. And of course, the question of Palestine is also a really desperate disappointment. After that great speech he made in Cairo, in which I think many people thought, this is a different attitude. Here is and a different tone, as you say, it's a completely different kind of person. But actually, when it comes down to, he doesn't even do as much as the first George Bush did, who did at least at one point freeze or threaten to freeze funding for the Israelis to stop settlements. So I'm afraid I feel he's come up against a system that he can't do anything with. Yes.
Yeah. I just want to ask a question about Mordecai Vanunu, who I suppose was the classic whistleblower, and the fate that he suffered and still Israel or Zionist project? Isn't there a way forward which is between those, to support the peace activists in Israel and to support Mordechai Vanunu intention, which was to explore the destabilizing effect that nuclear weapons in the Middle East really does have on the region?
Yes, Vanunu is a deeply tragic figure. I saw him last month. I was in Jerusalem and I saw him. I've seen him several times before, and I think the refusal to allow him to go abroad and to keep him in the kind of limbo that he is an act of great pettiness. They've really tried to break the guy. But I know he does take a great deal of comfort from the fact that there are outsiders like you who raise his name in meetings and you probably write to him or so on. I mean, I think it's, as I say, it's a really tragic case. Don't really know what to say in response to the rest of your question because it's so enormous. So I think I'll just say that I think there isn't any question that the two-state solution is over. I've been going there. Last year I went 3 times, and I last went in November, and then I went again last month. And on each occasion, even with as little as 3 or 4 months between the visits, the creation of facts on the ground in terms of the bypass roads, the blocking off and fragmenting of different Palestinian entities, and the huge growth of settlements you can't miss it. That's why I get so sad when I hear Tony Blair and others, Obama even, talking about the two-state solution as though it's real. I happen to know the UN official who does the briefings for top diplomats and military people who come from the West to Israel and Palestine. And I know what he tells them. I know the maps he shows them. They know that it's not true when they talk about let's get the peace process back on track. I think that it's too big for anyone to, any outsider to make a real contribution to changing the dynamic. But I think there are kind of 2 aspects. One is that the present government, which I called rather politely, I thought very irresponsible. I don't know if any of you heard the interview on the BBC this morning with the president of Syria, who called it a pyromaniac government. And I think that's exactly what it is. What they did with the Turkish flotilla, I think has set a kind of dynamic within the Middle East that is very, very negative indeed. And the way that the government in Jerusalem has tried to make Iran into the real issue and to kind of talk up a war with Iran is exactly what happened in the run-up to the war with Iraq. So for all those reasons, I'm very pessimistic. And I don't think that the Israeli peace movement has exactly covered itself in glory. It's very small, extremely brave, not just Vanunu, but all the young people who go to Sheikh Jarrah and other places in Jerusalem. And the small numbers of soldiers who refuse to serve in the occupied territories and so on. It's great, but it's tiny, and it's not changing the dynamic on the ground. And I do urge anybody who hasn't been to Palestine to make a visit. There are lots of different organisations that organise kind of ethical tours of one sort or another. And everybody I know who's been even once always come back saying, it's completely changed my life. It's completely different to what I thought. I don't think I can say anything more about that. As you can see, we could be here for 2 or 3 days while we discuss this issue.
Okay, thank you. I think we've kind of run out. We may have time for one. I know you've had your hand up for a while. Can we have one final question? Yeah.
Thank you for giving us such a broad picture, an international picture, which we don't very often hear. I appreciate that and learned a great deal. But there is, of course, the other thing you've emphasised is the importance of individuals. My son did a politics degree and he did some studies on political leaflets, and I said, what matters in the political leaflets then? And he said, it's the pictures of the people. And I think you brought quite clearly out, and I'm grateful for that, the significance of individuals who stand for truth and are very brave. Which brings me to my question, can you tell us anything about your work with women?
My work with women?
Yes.
Oh, Jesus, that's another whole day, excuse me. That's at least another whole day. All I want to say on my work with women, the latest work, I've been working with, not working with, I have become friends with a number of Muslim women who are wives of detainees, either here in Britain or, as I said, in Guantanamo. And it's been my great privilege to have met people so resourceful, so strong, so dignified. And on the whole, I think that women are fantastic. And if you're in a tight place, I'd always rather be with a woman than with a man.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for coming, and especially to the Lord Mayor and the Lady Mayoress for coming too, for the Leeds City Council for the hospitality, for Roger for organising the event, for Michael for initiating the whole series of lectures, but of course also to Victoria for coming in. I think what at least is a thought-provoking and fascinating talk, and I think you'll all go home thinking about things perhaps slightly differently. Maybe you'll all get active in some way, which would be wonderful, because that's one of the things we want to try and encourage people to do, get up and do things. So thank you very much again. Thank you.